February 17th, 1977, should have been just another freezing Thursday night in Buffalo. Another shift ending at the diner. Another walk through snow-packed streets toward a warm apartment. For 22-year-old Kimberly Anne Brennan with auburn hair that caught the streetlight and a laugh that made tired customers smile, it became something else entirely. She waved goodbye to her coworker at 11:45 and started walking. Nobody ever saw her alive again. Kimberly Anne Brennan had the kind of face that belonged in photographs, the kind strangers remembered. She was 5 feet 7 inches tall, slender, with auburn hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and green eyes that seemed to notice everything. She had a constellation of freckles across her nose that darkened in summer and a habit of tucking her hair behind her left ear when she was thinking. At 22 years old, she was young enough to still believe the world was mostly good and old enough to know she needed to work hard to survive in it. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment on Richmond Avenue in the Black Rock neighborhood, a working-class section of Buffalo where houses pressed close together and everyone knew their neighbor's business. The apartment was small, a 4th-floor walk-up with radiators that clanked and hissed and windows that frosted over in winter, but it was hers. She'd moved in 6 months earlier after finally saving enough from her job at Morrison's Diner on Niagara Street, a 24-hour establishment with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that played the same Fleetwood Mac songs on repeat. Kimberly worked the evening shift, 4 in the afternoon until midnight, 5 days a week. She poured coffee and took orders and learned regulars' preferences, remembered that Mr. Kowalski wanted his eggs over easy and that the truck drivers from the steel plant took their coffee black with 2 sugars. She was good at the work, efficient and kind, the type of waitress who made minimum wage feel almost worth it through sheer determination. She had plans beyond Morrison's, talked about taking classes at Erie Community College in the fall, maybe studying to be a dental hygienist or a paralegal, something with better hours and a future. Her family lived 15 blocks away on Tonawanda Street, a 2-story house with aluminum siding and a chain-link fence around the small front yard. Her father, Patrick Brennan, was a foreman at the Bethlehem steel plant, a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands who'd worked the same job for 23 years. Her mother, Catherine, cleaned houses for wealthy families in Williamsville, taking the bus out to the suburbs 3 days a week and coming home exhausted. They had 3 other children, Kimberly being the oldest. Her brother Michael was 19 and worked construction. Her sisters, Colleen and Maureen, were 16 and 14, still in high school at Bishop Timon. February 17th, 1977 was a Thursday, and Buffalo was locked in the grip of a brutal winter that felt like it would never end. The city had been buried under snow since November, the infamous blizzard of '77, still 2 weeks away, but the groundwork already laid in feet of accumulated ice and snow. The temperature that night hovered around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, the wind coming off Lake Erie with teeth that bit through any coat. Kimberly's shift at Morrison's Diner had been unremarkable. The dinner rush had been steady but not overwhelming, mostly regulars seeking hot coffee and comfort food to fight off the cold. She'd worn her uniform, a mint green dress with white collar and cuffs that the diner required, covered by a white apron that got stained with coffee and ketchup by the end of every shift. Over it, she wore her winter coat, a brown corduroy jacket with synthetic fur lining that she'd bought on sale at AM&A's department store. She had on blue jeans underneath the uniform dress, snow boots with fake fur trim, and a knitted cream-colored hat her mother had made her for Christmas. Her coworker that night was Linda Peretti, 26 years old, who'd been at Morrison's for 4 years and knew the rhythm of the place better than anyone. Linda and Kimberly had become friends over the months, sharing cigarette breaks in the alley behind the diner and complaining about cheap tippers and the cook's terrible jokes. That Thursday night, they'd worked in comfortable tandem, Linda taking the counter while Kimberly handled the booths, both of them counting down the minutes until their shift ended at midnight. The last customer left at 11:35, an older man who'd nursed a single cup of coffee for 2 hours while reading the Buffalo Evening News. Kimberly and Linda spent the final 25 minutes of their shift doing closing tasks, wiping down tables, refilling sugar dispensers, counting their tips. Kimberly had made $14.63 in tips that night, decent for a Thursday in February. She folded the bills carefully and put them in her wallet, dropped the change into her purse. They clocked out at 11:45, both of them punching their time cards in the machine by the kitchen, the mechanical stamp marking the exact moment their shift ended. The manager, Harold Chen, was doing paperwork in the back office and called out goodnight without looking up. They pulled on their coats in the narrow break room, Kimberly tugging the cream-colored hat down over her ears, Linda wrapping a scarf around her face. They walked out together through the front door, the bell jingling as it closed behind them. The street was empty, most businesses closed for the night, streetlights casting yellow circles on the snow-packed sidewalks. Their breath came out in white clouds. Linda's car, a rusty Plymouth Duster, was parked half a block away, and she offered Kimberly a ride like she always did. Kimberly said no like she always did. The walk home was only 12 blocks, maybe 15 minutes at a steady pace, and she didn't mind it. She liked the cold air after hours in the overheated diner, liked the quiet of the city at night, the way Buffalo felt almost peaceful under its blanket of snow. Linda didn't push it. She hugged Kimberly goodbye, told her to stay warm, watched as Kimberly started walking east on Niagara Street toward Richmond Avenue. That was 11:45 exactly. Linda remembered because she'd checked her watch, worried about getting home to relieve her babysitter. She got into her car, spent a few minutes scraping ice off the windshield, started the engine to let it warm up. When she finally pulled away from the curb and drove past where Kimberly had been walking, she couldn't see her anymore. The street curved slightly, and the snow made visibility poor. Linda assumed Kimberly had just gotten ahead, was already turning onto one of the side streets toward home. She didn't think anything of it. Why would she? Kimberly never arrived at her apartment on Richmond Avenue. Her roommate, a woman named Patricia Walsh, who worked at a bank downtown, was already asleep when Kimberly should have gotten home. Patricia didn't realize anything was wrong until Friday morning, when she woke up around 7 and saw Kimberly's bedroom door still open, her bed clearly not slept in. Even then, Patricia didn't panic immediately. Maybe Kimberly had met someone after work, maybe she'd gone to her parents' house, maybe something completely ordinary had happened. But when Catherine Brennan called the apartment at 9 Friday morning asking if Kimberly wanted to come over for dinner that weekend, Patricia mentioned that Kimberly hadn't come home. Catherine's voice changed instantly, became sharp with fear. Kimberly always came home. She was responsible, predictable. She called if her plans changed. Catherine asked Patricia to check Kimberly's room, see if anything was missing, any sign she'd packed a bag. Patricia looked. Everything was there. Kimberly's hairbrush on the dresser, her alarm clock ticking on the nightstand, clothes hanging in the closet. The only things missing were what she'd been wearing to work, the items she'd had with her, her purse, her wallet, her keys, her work uniform under that brown corduroy coat. Catherine hung up and immediately called Patrick at the steel plant, pulled him off the floor with an emergency message. Within 30 minutes, both parents were at Morrison's diner, pushing through the lunch crowd to find Harold Chen. Where was their daughter? When did she leave? Who saw her last? Harold checked the time cards, confirmed Kimberly had clocked out at 11:45 the previous night. He brought out Linda Peretti from the kitchen where she was starting her afternoon shift. Linda explained she'd been the last person to see Kimberly, described offering her a ride, watching her walk east on Niagara Street. Her voice shook as she spoke, the implications settling over all of them like falling snow. Patrick Brennan called the Buffalo Police Department from the payphone outside the diner at 12:18 Friday afternoon, February 18th, 1977. He reported his daughter missing. The officer who took the call, a desk sergeant named Walter Morrison, wrote down the information in careful block letters on a missing person report form. Name, age, physical description, last known location, time last seen. He told Patrick that most missing adults turned up within 24 hours, that young women sometimes needed space, that she'd probably walked in the door by dinner time. But Patrick knew better. He knew his daughter. She wouldn't do this, wouldn't disappear without a word, wouldn't let her mother worry. Something was wrong. Something had happened between Morrison's diner and the apartment on Richmond Avenue, in those 12 blocks of dark streets and frozen sidewalks. By Friday evening, when Kimberly still hadn't appeared, hadn't called, hadn't given any sign of life, the Buffalo Police Department assigned a detective to the case. His name was Anthony Russo, 41 years old, a 15-year veteran of the department who'd worked everything from robbery to homicide. He was a stocky man with dark hair going gray at the temples and brown eyes that missed nothing. He'd grown up in Buffalo, knew the city's rhythms, understood that a young woman didn't just vanish between work and home without reason. Detective Russo started with the route. Friday night, he walked the exact path Kimberly should have taken from Morrison's diner to her apartment on Richmond Avenue, 12 blocks through the heart of Black Rock. He walked slowly, studying every alley and doorway, every place someone could hide or be hidden. The temperature had dropped into single digits, the wind brutal off the lake. He wore a heavy coat and gloves, and still felt the cold gnawing at him. What must it have been like for Kimberly in just that corduroy jacket? The route was straightforward, east on Niagara Street for 6 blocks, passing closed storefronts and the occasional corner bar still serving its regulars. Then a left turn north onto Amherst Street for 3 blocks through a residential area of narrow houses packed tight together. Finally, a right turn onto Richmond Avenue for the final 3 blocks to her building. Russo walked it twice, once in early evening around the time Kimberly had been walking, once after midnight to match the exact conditions. He found nothing. No signs of struggle, no abandoned personal items, no witnesses who'd seen anything unusual. Saturday morning, he organized a search party. 34 volunteers, mostly family and neighbors, spread out in a grid pattern covering a 10-block radius around the route. They looked in alleys and behind dumpsters, in abandoned buildings and empty lots, anywhere a body might have been left or hidden. They found nothing. The snow that had been falling intermittently all week had covered everything, made searching difficult and probably obscured any evidence that might have been dropped or discarded. Russo interviewed everyone who'd been at Morrison's diner Thursday night. The cook, Jerome Matthews, said he'd been in the kitchen the whole shift. Hadn't noticed anything unusual. Harold Chen confirmed the same, said Kimberly, had seemed normal, in good spirits, hadn't mentioned meeting anyone or going anywhere after work. Linda Peretti went over her story again, crying now as the seriousness of the situation became clear. She described exactly what Kimberly had been wearing: the cream hat, the brown coat, the snow boots. She blamed herself for not insisting on giving Kimberly a ride, for driving away, for not watching to make sure she got farther down the street. Russo interviewed the regulars who'd been in the diner that night. Most remembered Kimberly, said she'd been friendly and professional like always. One customer, a truck driver named Donald Vickers, mentioned he'd left around 11 and had seen a dark-colored car parked on Niagara Street near the diner when he walked to his rig. He couldn't describe it beyond that, didn't know the make or model, wasn't even sure if it had still been there when the diner closed. Russo wrote it down anyway, knowing it might mean nothing or everything. The detective went door to door along the route Kimberly should have walked, knocking on every house and apartment, asking if anyone had heard or seen anything Thursday night around midnight. Most people had been asleep. A few had been watching television. Nobody had noticed a young woman walking past, hadn't heard screams or sounds of struggle, hadn't seen a car that seemed out of place. The cold kept people inside, made them less likely to look out windows or pay attention to street activity. One witness emerged Saturday afternoon, an older man named Stanley Kowalski, who lived on Amherst Street near where Kimberly should have turned onto Richmond Avenue. He'd been up late Thursday night, couldn't sleep, sitting by his window, smoking and watching the street. He thought he might have seen a young woman walking north around midnight, wearing a light-colored hat. But he wasn't certain of the time, couldn't describe her beyond that, didn't see where she went. His testimony was too vague to be useful, but it suggested Kimberly had made it at least 3/4 of the way home before something happened. Detective Russo examined Kimberly's life for anything that might explain her disappearance. He went through her apartment, with Patricia Walsh's permission, looking for diaries or letters, anything that might indicate trouble. He found a tidy, modest life, bills paid on time, a few library books about medical careers, photographs of family and friends, no evidence of drugs or debt, no threatening letters, no sign of a secret boyfriend or dangerous entanglement. He interviewed Michael, Kimberly's younger brother. Michael said his sister was careful, smart, not naive about the world. She didn't take risks, didn't talk to strangers, always locked her door. He couldn't imagine her getting into a car with someone she didn't know. Couldn't imagine any scenario where she'd willingly go somewhere in the middle of the night without telling anyone. The Brennan family sat in their living room on Tonawanda Street and went over everyone Kimberly knew, every person who might wish her harm. The list was essentially empty. She didn't have enemies. She'd dated occasionally, but nothing serious in the past year. Nobody who'd been angry or possessive when things ended. She was friendly with coworkers, but didn't socialize much outside of work. Her life revolved around family, saving money, planning for a better future. By the end of the first week, Detective Russo had exhausted the immediate leads. He'd interviewed over 50 people, walked the route a dozen times, searched everywhere that made sense to search. He'd found no body, no evidence of violence, no clear suspects. The case file was growing, but the answers weren't. The forensic capabilities available to him in 1977 were limited. Fingerprint analysis required clear prints and a suspect to compare them to. Blood typing existed, but only if there was blood to test. DNA analysis wouldn't be available for another decade. Kimberly's face appeared on missing person flyers stapled to telephone poles throughout Black Rock, taped inside shop windows along Niagara Street, distributed to police departments in surrounding counties. The flyer showed her employee photo from Morrison's Diner, smiling in her mint green uniform. Beneath the photo, missing, Kimberly Anne Brennan, age 22, last seen February 17th, 1977. The description listed her height, weight, the auburn hair, the green eyes. At the bottom, if you have any information, please contact Buffalo Police Department. Catherine Brennan stopped going to her cleaning jobs, unable to function. She sat by the phone waiting for it to ring, jumping at every sound. Patrick continued working at the steel plant because someone had to pay the bills, but his coworkers said he moved like a ghost, his mind clearly elsewhere. Michael dropped out of his construction job to help search, spending every day walking Buffalo's streets looking for any sign of his sister. Colleen and Maureen went back to school but couldn't concentrate, their grades slipping as their family fell apart around them. The local news covered the story for 3 days, brief segments on the 10 o'clock news showing Kimberly's photo and asking for tips. The Buffalo Evening News ran a longer article on page 4, interviewing the family and Detective Russo. But there were no dramatic developments to keep the story alive, no shocking revelations to maintain public interest. By the end of February, the coverage had stopped. Kimberly Anne Brennan had become another missing person statistic, another unsolved case in a city with bigger problems. Detective Russo kept working it, but the case was growing cold even as winter refused to release its grip on Buffalo. The infamous blizzard of '77 hit in late January, burying the city under 7 feet of snow, paralyzing everything for days. When the city finally dug out, it felt like whatever had happened to Kimberly Brennan had been buried too, frozen under all that accumulated ice and snow, preserved but inaccessible. By March, with no body found and no solid leads to follow, the case remained open but inactive. Russo had other cases demanding his attention, new crimes that needed solving. The file on Kimberly Anne Brennan went into a cabinet drawer at the Buffalo Police Department's 5th Precinct, a folder growing thick with reports that led nowhere, witness statements that contradicted each other or provided nothing useful, maps marked with search grids that had turned up empty. The Brennan family's life became divided into before and after February 17th, 1977. Before Kimberly disappeared, they'd been an ordinary working-class Buffalo family, struggling but intact, looking forward to the future. After, they became the family whose daughter had vanished, the ones who didn't know if she was dead or alive, suffering or escaped, gone forever, or possibly still out there somewhere waiting to be found. That not knowing became its own kind of torture, worse in some ways than grief, because grief at least had finality. The file labeled Brennan. Kimberly Anne lived in a cardboard box in the basement of the Buffalo Police Department's 5th Precinct, tucked between cases from the same era that had also gone cold. Crimes that time and limited technology had rendered unsolvable. By 1980, Detective Anthony Russo had retired, his last years on the force haunted by the cases he couldn't close, Kimberly's face among them. His replacement, a younger detective named Michael Fernandez who'd never met Kimberly, who knew her only as a photograph paperclipped to an incident report, inherited the file along with dozens of others. The first decade after Kimberly's disappearance was marked by the slow, grinding realization that she might never be found. Catherine Brennan refused to accept it. Every February 17th, she placed a notice in the Buffalo News, the same text year after year, the cost of $38 that the family could barely afford but Catherine insisted on. The notice read, "Kimberly Anne Brennan, missing since February 17th, 1977. If you have any information, please contact Buffalo Police Department. We will never stop looking. We will never stop loving you. Mom, Dad, Michael, Colleen, and Maureen. Patrick Brennan, aged in ways that had nothing to do with years. His hair went white by 1982, his face developing deep lines that made him look a decade older than he was. He continued working at Bethlehem Steel until the plant began its slow death in the mid-80s. Layoffs and closures that marked Buffalo's transformation from industrial powerhouse to Rust Belt casualty. When he was finally let go in 1986 after 32 years at the plant, he took a job as a night security guard at a warehouse on the waterfront, sitting alone in the dark for 8-hour shifts with too much time to think about his missing daughter. Michael Brennan, Kimberly's younger brother, left Buffalo in 1979, unable to bear the weight of the city where his sister had disappeared. He moved to Cleveland, found work in construction, married a woman named Susan who knew about Kimberly but learned quickly not to mention her name. Michael called his parents every Sunday, conversations that were brief and strained, neither side knowing what to say anymore. He came home for Christmas and Easter, visits that left everyone exhausted from the effort of pretending normalcy. Colleen graduated from Bishop Timon in 1979 and went to nursing school at D'Youville College, staying in Buffalo because someone needed to be close to their parents. Someone needed to watch as they slowly broke apart. She married in 1984, had 2 children by 1988, built a life that existed in the shadow of her missing sister. Her children grew up knowing about Aunt Kimberly, the woman in the photographs who'd disappeared before they were born, the ghost that haunted every family gathering. Maureen, the youngest, left as soon as she could. She graduated high school in 1981 and moved to Boston for college, putting 400 miles between herself and the grief that saturated their family home. She studied psychology, perhaps trying to understand trauma from an academic distance, and eventually became a therapist specializing in families affected by violence and loss. She rarely came home, her absence another wound that Catherine and Patrick bore silently. The investigation, such as it was, continued in fits and starts through the 1980s. Detective Fernandez would periodically pull the file, review the evidence, follow up on tips that occasionally came in through the department's phone line. Someone claimed to have seen a woman matching Kimberly's description working at a diner in Rochester. Fernandez drove there, interviewed the woman, confirmed it wasn't her. A psychic called saying she'd had visions of Kimberly's body in the Niagara River. Search teams dragged sections of the river, found nothing. A man in Erie County Jail claimed his cellmate had confessed to killing a waitress in Buffalo in the 70s. Fernandez interviewed the cellmate, determined the story was fabricated, a bid for attention or a reduced sentence. Each false lead was its own small tragedy, hope kindled and then extinguished. Catherine would hear about a possible sighting and allow herself to imagine Kimberly walking through the door, alive somehow, with an explanation for everything. Then Fernandez would call with the news that it was nothing, another dead end, and Catherine would retreat into the silence that had become her default state. The technology available to law enforcement evolved slowly through the 80s, but remained primitive by later standards. Fingerprint databases were manual card systems, cross-referencing requiring hours of tedious comparison. Blood typing could be done if samples were available, but offered limited specificity. Composite sketches were drawn by hand, based on witness descriptions. Missing person cases without bodies were particularly difficult because there was nothing physical to analyze, no crime scene to process, only absence. Buffalo itself changed dramatically during these years. The blizzard of '77 became the defining moment of the decade, a disaster that somehow encapsulated the city's decline. The steel industry collapsed, taking thousands of jobs with it. The population hemorrhaged, young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere, neighborhoods emptying out. The area where Kimberly had disappeared, Black Rock, went from working-class stability to increasing poverty and abandonment. Morrison's Diner closed in 1983, the building eventually becoming a discount furniture store and then sitting vacant. The Brennan house on Tonawanda Street became a kind of shrine. Catherine kept Kimberly's bedroom exactly as it had been, the alarm clock on the nightstand frozen at the time the batteries died in 1978, the clothes still hanging in the closet, the hairbrush on the dresser with auburn strands still caught in the bristles. Patrick thought it was unhealthy but said nothing, understanding that his wife was preserving the last tangible evidence that their daughter had existed. Other unsolved disappearances from the same era haunted Buffalo's collective memory. Kimberly wasn't the only young woman who'd vanished. The though her case remained the most prominent in the media's sporadic coverage. There was Susan Martinez, disappeared in 1975. Jennifer Cole, missing since 1978. The cases had similarities: young women last seen at night, no bodies ever found, investigations that went nowhere. Some wondered if there was a connection, if Buffalo had a predator operating undetected, but without evidence, without bodies, there was no way to establish links. The late 80s brought the beginning of computerization to law enforcement. The Buffalo Police Department installed its first computer system in 1987, a clunky network that allowed digital record-keeping and faster access to information. Detective Fernandez entered Kimberly's case into the new system, digitizing reports that had existed only on paper. It was tedious work, typing decades of investigation notes into the primitive database, but it meant the information was now searchable, could be cross-referenced with other cases. The National Crime Information Center expanded its missing person database, and Kimberly's information was entered there as well, making her case accessible to law enforcement agencies across the country. It was progress, incremental and insufficient, but progress nonetheless. If someone matching her description was found anywhere, if a Jane Doe turned up with characteristics that aligned, the database might make a connection. But the 80s ended with no resolution. Catherine Brennan turned 55 in 1989, her health deteriorating under the accumulated stress. She developed high blood pressure and chronic insomnia, took pills to sleep and pills to wake up. Patrick was 60, his body worn down by decades of manual labor and grief. They talked sometimes about moving, leaving Buffalo and its memories behind, but could never bring themselves to do it. What if Kimberly came back and they weren't there? What if someone finally found her and needed to contact them? The 1990s brought technological revolution that would eventually transform cold case investigation, though the impact wasn't immediately apparent. DNA analysis became more sophisticated, moving from simple blood typing to genetic profiling that could identify individuals with extraordinary specificity. The FBI launched CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, in 1998, creating a national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes. Detective Fernandez, still working cold cases among his other responsibilities, saw the potential. He pulled the Brennan file again in 1999 and reviewed what physical evidence had been preserved. There wasn't much. No body meant no biological samples directly from Kimberly. No crime scene meant no blood or tissue or hair that might contain perpetrator DNA. The investigation had collected nothing physical that could be subjected to modern analysis. The file was full of paper, witness statements, and search reports and dead-end leads, but paper couldn't be tested in a laboratory. Still, Fernandez submitted what little they had to the state crime lab. Kimberly's hairbrush from her apartment, preserved in an evidence bag for over 20 years, could provide her DNA profile. If her body was ever found, if remains turned up somewhere, they'd be able to confirm identity definitively. It was something, though not enough. The media landscape changed too. Cable television brought shows like Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted, programs that featured cold cases and missing persons, enlisting public help in solving crimes. Catherine Brennan contacted these shows, sent them Kimberly's information, begged them to feature her daughter's case. America's Most Wanted aired a brief segment in 2000, 3 minutes devoted to Kimberly's disappearance, showing her photograph and the sparse details of that February night in 1977. The segment generated 43 phone calls to the tip line. 42 of them were useless, people who thought they'd seen someone who might have been Kimberly in shopping malls or restaurants, vague possibilities that fell apart under scrutiny. The 43rd call came from a woman in Syracuse who said her deceased father had been a truck driver who'd worked the Buffalo-Syracuse route in the 70s and had once made an odd comment about a girl he'd given a bull ride to who'd never gotten out of his truck. Fernandez drove to Syracuse, interviewed the woman, tried to track down her father's old logbooks. The trail led nowhere. The father had died in 1994, and whatever he'd known had died with him. Patrick Brennan died in 2003, a massive heart attack that killed him instantly at age 74. He was found slumped in his chair in the living room on Tonawanda Street, the television still playing. Catherine found him when she came home from the grocery store. At the funeral, attended by what remained of Buffalo's old neighborhood networks, People whispered that Patrick had died of a broken heart, that losing Kimberly had killed him as surely as any disease, just took longer. Catherine couldn't stay in the house after that, couldn't bear the rooms full of memories and preserved shrines. Colleen moved her mother into an apartment in Cheektowaga, smaller and more manageable. Catherine brought only essentials and Kimberly's photograph, the one from the missing person flyer, which she placed on her nightstand. She was 71 years old and looked ancient, her body bent, her mind starting to wander into confusion that might have been early dementia or might have been just exhaustion from carrying grief for over a quarter century. The 2000s brought another technological leap: social media and the internet's democratization of information. Websites dedicated to cold cases and missing persons proliferated, amateur sleuths and armchair detectives discussing unsolved mysteries in forums and comment sections. Kimberly's case appeared on several of these sites, her story retold by strangers who'd never known her, theories proposed about what might have happened. Some thought she'd been the victim of a serial killer, perhaps someone passing through Buffalo who struck randomly and moved on. Others speculated about a local predator who'd targeted vulnerable women and managed to avoid detection. A few suggested she'd run away voluntarily, started a new life somewhere, though anyone who'd known Kimberly dismissed this immediately. She wouldn't have done that to her family. Detective Fernandez retired in 2008 after 32 years with the Buffalo Police Department. The Brennan case was one of his greatest failures, a reminder that not every mystery could be solved no matter how hard you worked. He'd given the file to his successor, a younger detective named Sarah Martinez, no relation to the Susan Martinez who disappeared in the 70s but aware of the coincidence. Martinez was 36 years old, the first woman to head the cold case unit at the 5th Precinct. She'd grown up in Buffalo, had vague childhood memories of missing person flyers on telephone poles, though she couldn't remember specific names. She approached old cases with fresh eyes and an understanding of tools that hadn't existed when most of the crimes occurred. In 2010, Martinez initiated a comprehensive review of all cold cases from the 1970s, looking for patterns or connections that earlier investigators might have missed. She created a spreadsheet documenting every unsolved disappearance and murder from that decade, noting similarities in victim profile, location, method, timeline. Kimberly Brennan's case sat alongside dozens of others, a data point in a larger pattern that refused to resolve into clarity. What Martinez noticed was that many of these cases had minimal physical evidence because the bodies had never been found. Without crime scenes to process, without remains to analyze, the investigations had been hobbled from the start. But advances in ground-penetrating radar and forensic archaeology meant that even old burial sites could potentially be located if searchers knew where to look. She began working with a forensic geographer from the University at Buffalo, a professor named Dr. James Chen, who specialized in analyzing geographic patterns in serial crimes. Chen examined the locations where victims had last been seen, looking for clusters or corridors that might indicate a predator's hunting ground or disposal preferences. Black Rock, where Kimberly had disappeared, fell within a zone that had seen multiple disappearances over a 15-year period from the early 70s to the late 80s. Chen's analysis suggested several areas where bodies might have been disposed of based on accessibility, isolation, and geographic logic. Abandoned industrial sites along the Buffalo River. Undeveloped lots in areas that had been rural in the 70s, but were now partially developed, sections of parks or conservation land that were remote enough for secrecy. But searching these areas would require resources the department didn't have, manpower and equipment that weren't available for decades-old cases when current crimes demanded attention. Martinez wrote grant proposals, seeking federal funding through programs designed to support cold case investigations. She was turned down twice before finally receiving a small grant in 2014 that would allow limited forensic searches. By then, Catherine Brennan was living in a nursing home, her mind mostly gone to dementia. She no longer remembered what year it was, sometimes didn't recognize her own daughters, but she remembered Kimberly with crystalline clarity. Colleen visited twice a week, sitting beside her mother's bed while Catherine told stories about Kimberly as a child. Memories that looped and repeated but never lost their vividness. Catherine died in her sleep in August of 2015, at age 81, finally released from the vigil she'd kept for 38 years. The funeral was small, Michael came from Cleveland with his adult children who'd never met their grandmother in any meaningful way. Maureen flew in from Boston, gray-haired now and worn down by her own career spent absorbing other people's trauma. Colleen stood between her siblings at the graveside service, the only one who'd stayed, the only one who'd witnessed the full arc of their parents' dissolution. At the reception afterward, held in the basement of the church the Brennans had attended for 50 years, Detective Martinez introduced herself to the family. She explained that the cold case unit was still actively working on Kimberly's disappearance, that new techniques might finally provide answers. She saw the flicker of something, not quite hope because hope had been exhausted long ago, but perhaps a kind of grim determination, in the faces of Kimberly's siblings. The mid-2000s teens brought another revolution in forensic science: genetic genealogy. Traditional DNA analysis could identify someone if their profile was already in a law enforcement database, but genetic genealogy used consumer DNA services to build family trees and identify suspects through their relatives. It had solved multiple cold cases, most famously identifying the Golden State Killer in 2018. Martinez attended a training seminar on investigative genetic genealogy in 2019. Sitting in a hotel conference room in Albany, learning about how DNA uploaded to sites like GEDmatch could be used to triangulate familial relationships and ultimately identify unknown perpetrators. It was complex, required specialized expertise, but it worked. Cases that had been unsolvable for decades were cracking open. The problem with Kimberly's case remained the same. They had no perpetrator DNA to analyze. Without a crime scene, without a body, without any physical evidence collected from an attacker, genetic genealogy was useless. They needed something to test first, some biological sample left behind by whoever had taken Kimberly. Martinez returned to Buffalo, determined to find it. She went back through the original case file, reading every report with the knowledge of what she was looking for. The dark-colored car Donald Vickers had mentioned seeing parked near Morrison's diner, the one detail that might have meant something, but had never been pursued fully. Had anyone checked if that car had been processed? Had it been located? The answer, buried in Fernandez's notes from the 1980s, was no. The car had been too vaguely described, too common to track down. Thousands of dark-colored vehicles in Buffalo alone. Without a license plate or even a make and model, there'd been nowhere to start. But Martinez knew something the earlier investigators hadn't, that DNA could survive for decades in unlikely places. If that car had been connected to Kimberly's disappearance, if she'd been inside it, there might still be trace evidence. The question was whether the car still existed somewhere, and whether it could be found 43 years later. She started with vehicle registration records from 1977, a database that had been digitized in the 2000s. She filtered for vehicles registered to addresses in Buffalo, specifically in neighborhoods near where Kimberly had disappeared. The list was enormous, thousands of entries. She needed to narrow it down. Working with data analysts at the police department, Martinez began cross-referencing vehicle registrations with other databases. Men with criminal records, particularly those involving violence or sexual offenses. Men who'd been interviewed during the original investigation but not seriously pursued. Men who'd left Buffalo shortly after February of 1977, suspicious timing that might indicate flight. It was painstaking work, months of searching through records, building connections that might mean nothing. But by late 2019, Martinez had a list of 47 names, men who'd owned vehicles matching the vague description and who had some other factor that made them potentially interesting. Most were dead now, having lived and died without ever being connected to Kimberly's disappearance. But several were still alive, elderly men in their 70s or 80s scattered across the country. Martinez began the process of investigating each name, building profiles, looking for any connection to Kimberly or the diner or the route she'd walked. It was frustrating work. Decades of history to sift through, people who'd moved and remarried and changed their lives multiple times. But she was patient, methodical, believing that somewhere in this data was the answer that had eluded everyone for over 40 years. The 2020s arrived, and with them a global pandemic that shut down much of the world for 2 years. Cold case work continued, Martinez working from home with digital files, but the pace slowed. Resources were redirected to current crises. The grant funding ran out. The searches Chen had proposed for potential burial sites were postponed indefinitely. But Martinez kept the Brennan file active, kept Kimberly's photograph on her desk, kept working the case when she could. She'd made a promise at Catherine Brennan's funeral, standing in that church basement with Kimberly's siblings, that she wouldn't let this case die, that she would find answers. It was the kind of promise that maybe shouldn't be made because it might be impossible to keep, but Martinez had meant it. By 2023, 46 years after Kimberly Anne Brennan had walked out of Morrison's diner into a February night and disappeared, the case remained unsolved. The file had grown to 3 boxes of materials, thousands of pages of reports and photographs and maps. 3 detectives had worked it over the decades. Both of Kimberly's parents had died without knowing what happened to their daughter. Buffalo itself had been transformed. The industrial city of the 1970s replaced by something different, struggling toward reinvention. But some things remained constant. Every February 17th, Colleen Brennan placed a notice in the Buffalo News, continuing the tradition her mother had started. The wording had changed slightly over the years, but the message stayed the same. Kimberly Anne Brennan, missing since February 17th, 1977. Still loved, still missed, still searching for answers. March 23, 2024, began as an ordinary Thursday for construction foreman Raymond Torres. The kind of early spring day in Buffalo, where the temperature climbed into the low 50s and the last stubborn piles of snow finally surrendered to the sun. Torres and his crew from Lakeshore Development had been working for 3 weeks on a demolition project in Black Rock, tearing down an abandoned warehouse complex on Amherst Street that had sat vacant and decaying for nearly 20 years. The building had once been a textile factory in the 1950s, later a furniture storage facility, and finally nothing at all, windows broken out and roof collapsing, a monument to Buffalo's long decline. The city had approved the demolition as part of a neighborhood revitalization plan, one of many attempts to breathe life back into areas that had been dying since the steel industry collapsed. The plan called for the warehouse to be razed and the lot cleared, eventually becoming a small park with walking paths and green space. It was optimistic urban planning, the kind Buffalo had been attempting for decades with mixed results, but the demolition work itself was straightforward. Bring in the excavators, knock down the walls, haul away the debris, grade the lot. Torres was 52 years old, had been in construction his entire adult life, and had demolished dozens of buildings across western New York. He knew what to expect: asbestos that needed careful removal, old foundations that resisted the excavator's bucket, rats and pigeons displaced from their longtime homes. What he didn't expect was what his equipment operator, a man named Carlos Mendez, uncovered that Thursday afternoon. Mendez had been working the northeastern corner of the property, using a Caterpillar excavator to dig up what remained of a concrete loading dock and the soil beneath it. The building had extended over part of this area, but time and vandalism had destroyed the floor, leaving just broken concrete and dirt that had been exposed to the elements for years. Mendez was scraping down to prepare for grading, removing about 3 feet of soil, when the excavator's bucket caught on something that felt different from rock or building debris. He stopped the machine, climbed down from the cab, and walked over to examine what he'd uncovered. Protruding from the torn earth was fabric, rotted and discolored, but unmistakably clothing. And beneath the fabric, partially exposed by the excavator's violence, was bone. Mendez had worked construction for 15 years, had seen plenty of strange things unearthed during demolition work, but never this. He backed away quickly, his stomach dropping, and shouted for Torres. Torres saw it immediately, knew what it was even before getting close. He'd been in Buffalo long enough, had lived through enough of the city's dark history to understand the implications. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911 at 2:37 in the afternoon, his voice steady despite the adrenaline making his hands shake. He reported human remains at the demolition site on Amherst Street, gave the address, told the dispatcher they'd need homicide detectives and a forensic team. Then he gathered his crew, moved them away from the excavation, and waited. Buffalo police arrived within 15 minutes, 3 patrol cars with lights flashing. The officers cordoned off the area with yellow crime scene tape, established a perimeter, called for additional units. Detective Sarah Martinez was in her office at the 5th Precinct when she got the call, and something in the location made her pulse quicken. Amherst Street and Black Rock, 3 blocks from where Kimberly Anne Brennan had last been seen 47 years ago, 3 blocks from the route she should have walked home. Martinez arrived at the scene at 3:08, accompanied by her partner, Detective James Walsh, a methodical man in his early 40s who joined the cold case unit 2 years earlier. The Erie County medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Foster, pulled up minutes later in her department vehicle, along with a forensic anthropologist from the University at Buffalo named Dr. Rebecca Chung. The team assembled at the edge of the excavation site, looking down at what Mendez's machine had revealed. Dr. Chung climbed down into the shallow crater first, moving carefully to avoid disturbing evidence. She was 41 years old, had worked on dozens of cases involving skeletal remains, brought a calm professionalism to scenes that overwhelmed others. She knelt beside the exposed bones, brushing away loose soil with a soft brush she pulled from her equipment bag, revealing more of what lay beneath. The remains were skeletal, as expected given the obvious age of the burial. The bones were brown and brittle, stained by decades in acidic soil. What clothing remained had deteriorated almost completely, reduced to fragments and fibers, but there were pieces that suggested original garments, denim, possibly jeans, synthetic material that might have been a coat lining, and visible even in the fading afternoon light, scraps of knitted fabric, cream-colored, degraded but still recognizable as handmade. Dr. Chung worked for 3 hours that afternoon and into the evening as portable lights were set up around the excavation. She documented everything with photographs, measured the position and depth of the remains, carefully exposed more of the skeleton without removing anything yet. This was a burial, she determined, not a body that had been dumped and left on the surface. Someone had dug here, placed the body deliberately, covered it with soil. The depth suggested it had been done quickly, maybe 3 feet down, not the 6 feet of a proper grave, but enough to hide what had been hidden. The location itself was significant. In 1977, this property had already been an abandoned textile factory, the business having closed in the early 1960s. The building had been empty but still standing, the loading dock area somewhat concealed from the street by the structure itself. Someone who knew the area, who understood it was abandoned and unwatched, could have brought a body here in the middle of the night without much risk of being seen. By 8 that evening, Dr. Chung had fully exposed the skeleton and the immediate surrounding soil. The remains were mostly complete, suggesting the body had been intact when buried rather than dismembered or scattered. The skull showed no obvious trauma, no bullet holes or crushing injuries that would indicate cause of death. But absence of skeletal trauma didn't rule out methods that left no mark on bone. Strangulation, suffocation, poisoning, all would be invisible now. Among the remains, carefully bagged and labeled, were items that had survived the decades. A wristwatch, the leather band completely rotted away, but the metal case intact, though corroded. A small metal object that might have been a key. And most significantly, fragments of what appeared to be identification, possibly a driver's license or ID card. The plastic cracked and the writing faded beyond legibility, but the card's shape still recognizable. The excavation was paused at nightfall, the site secured with additional barriers, and a patrol officer assigned to guard it overnight. Dr. Chung arranged for a complete forensic recovery to begin the next morning, a process that would take days, carefully removing soil around and beneath the remains, screening everything for evidence, documenting each stage with precision that was impossible in fading light. Martinez stood at the edge of the crime scene long after most of the team had left, staring down at the illuminated excavation. She'd worked the Brennan case for nearly 15 years, had inherited it from Fernandez, who'd inherited it from Russo. She'd met Kimberly's siblings, had promised them answers, had spent countless hours reviewing files and chasing leads that went nowhere. And now, 3 blocks from where Kimberly had disappeared, human remains that fit the general profile. Young female based on preliminary skeletal assessment, buried for decades based on decomposition and clothing style, located in an area that made terrible sense. But identification would take time. Skeletal remains couldn't be identified visually, couldn't be confirmed through fingerprints that no longer existed. They would need forensic analysis, DNA comparison, dental records if the skull's teeth were intact enough. Martinez called Colleen Brennan that night, reaching her at home in Cheektowaga. Colleen was 64 years old now, a grandmother, her auburn hair that had once matched her sister's gone completely gray. Martinez explained carefully that remains had been found, that it was too early to know if they were Kimberly's, that testing would be required. Colleen's response was quiet, controlled. She'd been expecting this call for 47 years, had played out this moment in her mind countless times. She asked if Martinez believed it was Kimberly. Martinez said honestly that the location and circumstances suggested it might be, but that they needed to wait for science to confirm. Colleen said she understood, that she'd contact Michael and Maureen, that they'd provide whatever DNA samples were needed for comparison. The forensic recovery continued through Friday and Saturday, Dr. Chung and her team working with archaeological precision. They removed the entire burial, not just the bones, but the soil matrix around them, preserving spatial relationships and collecting trace evidence that might have seemed insignificant but could prove crucial. Soil samples were taken from multiple depths and locations to be analyzed for pollen and botanical material that might indicate seasonality of burial or trace evidence from the perpetrator. The fabric fragments were particularly important. Modern forensic textile analysis could identify fiber types, manufacturing processes, even specific brands or products from degraded material. The cream-colored knitted fragments appeared consistent with a handmade hat, the kind someone's mother might have made. The denim was the heavy type used in 1970s clothing, not the lighter modern versions. The synthetic coat lining material was tested and identified as a type of nylon, commonly used in affordable outerwear, manufactured between 1970 and 1980. The skeleton was transported to the Erie County Medical Examiner's office, where Dr. Foster conducted a full examination. The remains were female, she confirmed, based on pelvic structure and skull characteristics. Age at death was approximately 20 to 25 years, based on dental development, bone fusion, and degenerative changes. Height estimated at 5 feet 6 to 5 feet 8 inches, based on femur length. The dental work showed several fillings consistent with 1970s-era dentistry, amalgam restorations that had survived when softer tissues hadn't. Most importantly, the teeth themselves were intact, a complete dental arcade that could be compared to ante-mortem records. Martinez had already pulled Kimberly Brennan's dental records from the original case file, X-rays taken in 1976 during a routine checkup at a dentist on Delaware Avenue. Dr. Foster brought in a forensic odontologist, Dr. Mark Stevens from the University at Buffalo School of Dental Medicine, to conduct the comparison. Stevens worked methodically, comparing the skull's teeth to the X-rays from 48 years earlier. He examined the pattern of fillings, the unique characteristics of each tooth, the alignment, and any anomalies. Dental identification was one of the most reliable methods of confirming identity, assuming good ante-mortem records existed. Every person's dentition was unique, a biological fingerprint that survived when flesh decayed. On Tuesday, March 26th, 3 days after the remains were discovered, Dr. Stevens completed his analysis. The match was conclusive. The dental records from 1976 and the teeth from the burial site belonged to the same person. The remains found beneath the old textile factory on Amherst Street were those of Kimberly Anne Brennan, missing since February 17th, 1977, finally found less than half a mile from where she'd last been seen alive. Martinez made the official notification to the family on Tuesday afternoon, driving to Colleen's house in Cheektowaga rather than delivering the news by phone. Colleen sat in her living room, her husband beside her, their adult children present for support, as Martinez explained that dental comparison had confirmed the identification. After 47 years, they knew where Kimberly was. They knew she hadn't run away or started a new life somewhere. They knew she'd been murdered and hidden, her body left in that abandoned lot, while her family searched and grieved and never stopped hoping. Colleen cried, the kind of deep, wrenching sobs that came from a well of grief that had been sealed but never emptied. Her husband held her while Martinez sat quietly, giving them time. When Colleen could speak again, she asked if they knew who'd done it, if there was any evidence that pointed to a killer. Martinez said they were analyzing everything recovered from the burial site, that modern forensic techniques might reveal what had been invisible in 1977, but that she couldn't make promises about solving a case this old. The DNA analysis began immediately. Dr. Chung's team had extracted samples from the femur, drilling carefully into the bone shaft where genetic material was most likely to have survived decades of burial. The process was complex. dealing with degraded DNA that had been exposed to soil microorganisms and fluctuating temperatures for nearly half a century. But modern extraction techniques were sophisticated, capable of recovering usable profiles from challenging samples. The DNA was sent to the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center in Albany, one of the most advanced crime labs in the state. There, it was processed through PCR amplification, generating copies of the genetic sequences present in the sample. Within 2 weeks, they had results: a complete mitochondrial DNA profile and a partial nuclear DNA profile, enough for identification purposes and for comparison against any suspect samples that might be developed. The profile was compared against the DNA extracted from Kimberly's hairbrush, preserved in evidence storage since Detective Fernandez had submitted it in 1999. The match confirmed what the dental records had already established. The remains were definitively Kimberly Anne Brennan. But the real value of the DNA analysis would come if they found perpetrator DNA in the burial site. Dr. Chung's team had collected soil samples and examined the clothing fragments for trace evidence, looking for biological material that didn't belong to the victim. It was a long shot after 47 years, but DNA could survive in unexpected places, protected from degradation by soil chemistry or trapped in fabric fibers. The examination revealed something promising. On one of the denim fragments, presumably from the jeans Kimberly had been wearing, there were stains that tested positive for blood using presumptive chemical tests. The stains were old and degraded, but blood was remarkably durable under certain conditions. More importantly, mixed with the blood were what appeared to be epithelial cells, skin cells, that might have been deposited during a violent struggle. The lab extracted DNA from these cells, a painstaking process that took 3 weeks and multiple attempts. The sample was heavily degraded, contaminated with soil bacteria and environmental DNA, but eventually they recovered a partial profile. It was male DNA, distinct from Kimberly's female profile, belonging to someone who'd been in close physical contact with her clothing, whose skin cells and blood had mixed with hers. The profile was run through CODIS, the national DNA database containing samples from millions of convicted offenders and arrestees. Martinez waited for results with the kind of anticipation she'd learned to temper over years of police work, knowing that most searches came back with no matches, that the database was comprehensive but not exhaustive. Many criminals had never been arrested or had committed their crimes before DNA collection became standard practice. The CODIS search returned no matches. Whoever's DNA was on Kimberly's clothing wasn't in the system, had never been convicted of a felony serious enough to require DNA collection, or had committed this crime before such databases existed and had avoided arrest since. It was disappointing, but not unexpected. The next step was forensic genealogy, the technique that had revolutionized cold case investigation by using consumer DNA databases to identify suspects through their relatives. Martinez contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company that specialized in genetic genealogy for law enforcement. They'd solved dozens of cold cases using DNA uploaded to public genealogy websites, building family trees backward through generations until they could identify the contributor. It was complex work, requiring both scientific expertise and genealogical research, but it had proven remarkably effective. Parabon's genetic genealogist, a woman named Dr. Lisa Chen, began working with the partial DNA profile in early May of 2024. She uploaded the profile to GED Match, a public database where users who'd tested with consumer services like Ancestry or 23andMe could share their genetic data for genealogical research. The upload generated matches, distant relatives who shared segments of DNA with the unknown male whose cells had been found on Kimberly's clothing. The matches were distant, third cousins and fourth cousins, people who shared great-great-grandparents with the target. Dr. Chen began the painstaking process of building family trees for each match, working backward through census records and birth certificates and marriage licenses, looking for common ancestors. The work took weeks, hundreds of hours of research, constructing elaborate genealogical charts that mapped out how these distant cousins connected. By June, Dr. Chen had identified a most recent common ancestor couple, a man and woman who'd lived in Buffalo in the early 1900s, and whose descendants included multiple people matching the DNA profile. From there, she worked forward through the generations, identifying all descendants of this couple, building out branches of the family tree. determining which lines were still alive and living in western New York in 1977. The research narrowed to 3 possible candidates: men who would have been in their 20s or 30s in 1977, who'd lived in Buffalo at the time, whose family lineage matched the genetic data. One had died in 1998. Another had moved to Florida in the early 80s and had an alibi placing him out of state in February of 77 based on employment records. The third name made Martinez's breath catch when she saw it. Robert Joseph Crane, born 1949, which would have made him 28 years old in February of 1977. Current address listed as West Seneca, a Buffalo suburb, meaning he still lived in the area nearly 50 years after Kimberly's murder. Martinez pulled his background immediately, searching for any previous police contact, any indication of violent behavior or criminal history. Crane had a record, minor incidents that hadn't required DNA collection, a disorderly conduct charge in 1983, dismissed. A DUI in 1992, pleaded down to a lesser offense. A domestic disturbance call in 2004, where his ex-wife had accused him of threatening her, though no charges were filed. Nothing that screamed murderer, but a pattern of aggressive behavior, of boundary violations, of a man who didn't always control his impulses. More significantly, Martinez discovered that in 1977, Robert Crane had worked as a delivery driver for a beverage distribution company based in Black Rock. His route would have taken him throughout the neighborhood, past Morrison's Diner, along the streets where Kimberly had walked. He would have driven a company truck, had legitimate reasons to be in the area at all hours. He would have been familiar with abandoned buildings and empty lots, places where deliveries were made, or where drivers took breaks away from supervision. Martinez pulled vehicle registration records from 1977, the same database she'd been working through for years as part of her systematic investigation. Robert Crane had owned a 1974 Dodge Dart, dark green, registered to an address on 15th Street in Black Rock, 6 blocks from Morrison's Diner. A dark-colored car, the detail that Donald Vickers had mentioned seeing parked near the diner the night Kimberly disappeared. The detail that had never been pursued because it was too vague to be useful without additional evidence. Everything was circumstantial, pieces that suggested possibility but didn't prove guilt. The DNA on Kimberly's clothing was partial and degraded, might not hold up to rigorous courtroom challenge. The genetic genealogy was sound science but still relatively new in legal contexts, potentially vulnerable to defense attacks. The vehicle match was suggestive but not definitive. Martinez needed more before she could make an arrest, needed something that would convince a prosecutor to file charges in a 47-year-old murder case. She began surveillance on Robert Crane in mid-June, watching his patterns, learning his routines. He was 75 years old now, retired from whatever work he'd done after leaving the beverage company in the 90s. He lived alone in a small house in West Seneca, drove a 10-year-old Toyota, lived a quiet life that gave no outward sign of a man who'd killed someone half a century earlier. But Martinez knew that monsters didn't always look monstrous, that evil could wear ordinary faces and live unremarkable lives while carrying terrible secrets. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Martinez had been reviewing the complete case file again, reading through every witness statement with the knowledge of what she now knew about Robert Crane. Buried in Detective Russo's original notes was an interview with a Morrison's Diner customer named Frank Patterson, who'd mentioned seeing the delivery driver from Quality Beverage Distributors talking to Kimberly during her shift on February 17th. Patterson had thought nothing of it at the time, said the guy was friendly, made jokes, seemed harmless. Russo had noted it but hadn't pursued it because there'd been no indication the delivery driver was relevant. Martinez tracked down Quality Beverage Distributors, long since out of business but with employment records archived at the State Labor Department. She requested Robert Crane's file and received it in early July. Among the documents was his delivery log for February 17, 1977, showing he'd made a stop at Morrison's Diner at 8:20 that evening, delivering cases of soda and beer. He would have seen Kimberly, would have interacted with her, would have known she worked there and what time her shift ended. It wasn't enough for an arrest warrant, not yet, but it was enough for Martinez to approach the Erie County District Attorney's office. She met with Assistant DA Catherine Morrison, a 43-year-old prosecutor who specialized in cold cases and who understood the challenges of bringing decades-old cases to trial. Martinez laid out everything they had: the DNA evidence, The genetic genealogy identification, Crane's presence at the diner the night of the murder, his ownership of a vehicle matching witness descriptions, his knowledge of the neighborhood, including abandoned buildings where a body could be hidden. Morrison listened carefully, asked pointed questions about evidence preservation and chain of custody, about the reliability of the DNA analysis and the legal precedents for genetic genealogy. She was cautious, aware that losing a case like this because of evidentiary weaknesses would be worse than not filing charges at all. But she was also convinced that they had enough to proceed, that a jury could be persuaded beyond reasonable doubt that Robert Joseph Crane had murdered Kimberly Anne Brennan in February of 1977. On July 23, 2024, 47 years and 5 months after Kimberly disappeared, a grand jury in Erie County returned an indictment charging Robert Joseph Crane with murder in the second degree. An arrest warrant was issued that same day, and Martinez assembled a team to execute it the following morning, wanting to take Crane at his house rather than create a public spectacle or risk flight. They arrived at 6 in the morning on July 24th, 4 unmarked police vehicles pulling up to the small house in West Seneca as the sun was just rising. Martinez knocked on the door, her badge visible, her partner beside her, and 4 additional officers positioned around the property. Robert Crane answered in a bathrobe and slippers, confusion crossing his face when he saw the police, an old man waking to a day he'd probably believed would never come. Martinez identified herself and told him he was under arrest for the murder of Kimberly Anne Brennan. She watched his face carefully, looking for reaction, for guilt or fear or relief. What she saw was a flicker of something, resignation maybe, or recognition of a name he'd carried silently for nearly 5 decades. He asked if he could get dressed. Martinez sent a female officer with him to ensure he didn't destroy evidence or harm himself. 10 minutes later, Robert Joseph Crane walked out of his house in handcuffs, was placed in the back of a patrol car, and was transported to the Erie County Holding Center to be processed and arraigned. The news broke within hours, a story that dominated Buffalo media and spread nationally. After 47 years, Kimberly Anne Brennan's murder had been solved through a combination of construction accident, forensic science, and genetic genealogy. The case became another example of how modern technology was finally bringing justice to victims whose killers had thought they'd escaped accountability. Martinez called Colleen Brennan that afternoon to tell her about the arrest before she heard it on the news. Colleen's reaction was complex, tears and something that wasn't quite joy but was profound relief. She said her parents had died not knowing, had carried that burden to their graves. She said she wished they could have lived to see this day. But she was grateful it had finally come. Grateful that someone would be held accountable, that Kimberly's death wouldn't remain forever unsolved. Robert Joseph Crane pleaded guilty on November 14, 2024, accepting a sentence of 25 years to life rather than face trial. At 75 years old, it was effectively a death sentence. He offered no explanation for why he'd killed Kimberly, no apology to her family, only a brief statement that he wanted to spare everyone a trial. Kimberly Anne Brennan was laid to rest on December 6th beside her parents in Forest Lawn Cemetery, finally home after 47 years. Colleen, Michael, and Maureen stood together at the graveside, a ceremony witnessed by hundreds who'd never known Kimberly but understood what her story represented. Detective Martinez kept Kimberly's photograph on her desk, a reminder that patience and technology could eventually pierce even decades of silence. In Buffalo, where winter still came hard and unforgiving, the case became proof that truth, however delayed, could still emerge from frozen ground where it had been buried, waiting.